A giant bear encounters a blind girl alone on the mountain. The situation seemed unlikely, but what happened next left everyone speechless. Dawn was breaking over the Adirondack Mountains, bringing with it a gentle breeze that rustled through the trees, carrying the characteristic freshness of the region. 5-year-old Emily stood still, her heightened senses taking in the world around her. Though her eyes couldn't see the breathtaking landscape, she could smell the damp earth and hear the birds beginning to stir from their slumber. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us from which city you're watching as we continue. Rachel, Emily's stepmother, held the little girl's hand firmly as they made their way up the steep trail. Something subtle yet unmistakable hung in the air, a nervousness that Emily could sense but couldn't quite understand. Rachel's voice maintained its sweet tone as she spoke about their destination, making promises of a magical place that awaited them. But had Emily been able to see, she would have noticed the tension in Rachel's face and the uncertainty in her expressions. Each step they took seemed weighted with hesitation, as if Rachel was fighting an internal battle. The fresh morning air carried the scent of pine needles and morning dew, a symphony of nature that Emily had learned to appreciate in her own unique way. Her small feet navigated the path carefully, trusting in Rachel's guidance. The woman who had entered her life as her stepmother maintained a steady stream of cheerful conversation, though her grip on Emily's hand occasionally tightened when they encountered particularly challenging sections of the trail. As they climbed higher, the path began to narrow, and the wind's whispers grew stronger among the trees. Rachel's footsteps became more deliberate, more purposeful, as if she was following a predetermined plan. The morning sun barely penetrated the thick canopy above them, creating a cool shade that made Emily pull her jacket closer around her shoulders. "The view from up here is beautiful, Emily," Rachel said, her voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that would have been obvious to anyone but a trusting 5-year-old. "The whole valley spreads out below us like a green carpet." She continued describing the scenery, perhaps more to fill the silence than to actually paint a picture for Emily. The little girl absorbed everything around her, the way the ground changed from soft dirt to rocky terrain, the subtle shift in the air temperature as they gained elevation, and the gradually changing symphony of forest sounds. Her world had always been one of textures, sounds, and smells, and this morning brought new sensations that both excited and slightly unsettled her. "Are we going much further?" Emily asked, her small voice curious rather than complaining. She could feel the steepness of their climb in her legs, but there was something else too, a change in the atmosphere that her sensitive nature picked up on, though she couldn't quite name it. "Not much further now, sweetheart," Rachel replied, and this time there was a slight tremor in her voice that she couldn't quite hide. "We're going to a very special place. I've been planning this for a while." The last part seemed to be spoken more to herself than to Emily. As they continued their ascent, the forest around them seemed to hold its breath. The morning birds had quieted somewhat, and the wind had taken on a different note, as if the mountain itself was aware of what was about to unfold. Rachel's steps became more hesitant, despite her attempt to maintain an air of normalcy. The trail wound its way up through ancient trees that had stood witness to countless seasons of change. Emily's fingers occasionally brushed against their rough bark when Rachel led her particularly close to the edge of the path. Each touch connected her to the age-old wisdom these silent sentinels contained, though she didn't yet understand the significance of their presence. Finally, they reached a wider section of the trail, a small clearing where the morning light managed to break through the canopy above. Rachel's footsteps slowed, then stopped altogether. The moment hung suspended in the cool mountain air, like the pause between heartbeats. Something was about to change, and even young Emily could feel the weight of it in the silence that had fallen around them. The wind carried the fresh scent of morning dew and pine needles, but there was something else too, a heaviness in the air that spoke of decisions about to be made and paths about to diverge. Rachel stood still, her hand still holding Emily's, as if frozen in this moment of decision that would alter both their lives forever. In the clearing atop the mountain, Rachel released Emily's hand, her movements sudden yet deliberate. "Stay right here, sweetheart," she said, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. "I need to get something special. Don't move from this spot." The words felt heavy on her tongue, each syllable laden with the weight of what she was about to do. Emily stood still, her small frame wrapped in the morning chill, listening as Rachel's footsteps grew fainter and fainter until they disappeared completely. At first, the silence felt peaceful, broken only by the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. The little girl remained exactly where she had been told to stay, her acute hearing picking up the subtle sounds of the mountain around her. Rachel's descent was quick. Her steps hurried as she tried to put distance between herself and what she had just done. "It's necessary," she whispered to herself, attempting to drown out the growing voice of guilt in her mind. "Taking care of Emily wasn't part of my plans." She repeated these words like a mantra, trying to convince herself that abandoning a blind 5-year-old was somehow justifiable. "Her limitations make everything more difficult," she continued, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. But something strange began to happen as Rachel made her way down the mountain. The trail, which had seemed so familiar during her previous visits and planning, began to look different. The trees appeared denser, closing in around her in ways she didn't remember. Each turn of the path seemed to lead to an unfamiliar section of the forest, though she was certain she was following the same route they had taken up. Back in the clearing, Emily remained motionless, exactly where Rachel had left her. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and the initial calm began to give way to a growing unease. The mountain winds carried new sounds to her sensitive ears, and the silence between them grew heavier with each passing moment. She called out Rachel's name several times, but only the echo of her own voice answered. Rachel's descent became increasingly difficult. The path seemed to shift and change with each step, as if the mountain itself was trying to confuse her. Branches appeared where she was certain none had been before, and the ground beneath her feet felt unstable in places that had been solid during their ascent. The growing sense of disorientation was accompanied by an unsettling feeling of being watched. In her haste to escape, Rachel stumbled upon something unexpected, a cabin she had never noticed before, despite her careful planning of this day. It stood among the trees, its weathered walls suggesting years of abandonment. Hesitating only briefly, she pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was dusty and dim, but there were signs of recent use that made Rachel's heart race. Fresh footprints marked the floor, and on a rough wooden table lay a map of the mountain. Next to it, a lantern still functioned, its weak light casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Rachel approached the map with trembling hands, noticing that it showed trails she had never known existed, including one marked with an X that led directly to the clearing where she had left Emily. Outside the cabin, the forest seemed to close in even tighter. The familiar landmarks Rachel had used to navigate had somehow shifted, making her feel increasingly trapped in this section of the mountain. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the wind carried sounds she couldn't quite identify, sounds that seemed to follow her movements. Each attempt to find her way back to the main trail led Rachel further into confusion. The paths split and merged in ways that defied her memory of the mountain's layout. Her earlier certainty about her actions began to crumble under the weight of growing fear and disorientation. The mountain appeared to be actively working against her, turning familiar territory into an ever-changing maze. As the morning wore on, Rachel's confident stride had been replaced by hesitant, uncertain steps. The map she had found in the cabin seemed to mock her attempts to navigate, its markings appearing to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The growing sense that she was being led astray by some unseen force became impossible to ignore. And for the first time since beginning her descent, Rachel wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Emily remained still in the clearing, her young mind trying to make sense of the silence that surrounded her. Despite her tender age, she possessed a remarkable sensitivity to her environment, catching subtle changes that others might miss. The wind had shifted direction, bringing with it a new scent, something strong and earthy that she had never encountered before. A peculiar sound caught her attention, a rustling that wasn't caused by the wind. It was the sound of something large moving slowly, deliberately. Emily's heart began to race, but not entirely from fear. There was something about this presence that felt different from anything she had experienced before. The footfalls were heavy yet careful, as if the creature was intentionally moving in a way that wouldn't startle her. At the base of the mountain, Margaret stood by her kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a morning cup of tea that had grown cold. Something felt terribly wrong. She had always possessed a spiritual connection with nature, particularly with these mountains that had been her home for decades. Today, that connection was sending her clear signals of distress. "Richard," she called to her husband, her voice carrying the weight of urgent concern. "Something's not right." Richard looked up from his morning routine, ready to dismiss her worry as he often did, but the expression on his wife's face made him pause. In all their years together, he had learned that when Margaret spoke with such certainty about her intuitions, there was usually good reason to listen. Back in the clearing, Emily felt a presence beside her, something enormous, warm and covered in thick fur. Instead of running or screaming, she remained perfectly still, sensing no threat from this massive creature. With trembling fingers, she reached out hesitantly, her small hand making contact with the bear's coarse fur. The animal remained calm, almost gentle, as if understanding the child's vulnerability. The bear's presence brought an unexpected sense of security. Its massive form positioned itself protectively near Emily, its warm breath visible in the cool mountain air. Despite her inability to see, Emily could sense the creature's size and strength, yet she felt no fear. There was something almost maternal in the way the bear had approached her, as if nature itself had sent a guardian to watch over her. Margaret and Richard began preparing for their ascent up the mountain. While Richard gathered basic hiking supplies, Margaret moved with purpose, driven by an understanding of the mountains that went beyond mere familiarity. She could feel the urgency building, an invisible force pushing her to hurry. Her connection to these ancient peaks had never felt stronger than it did in this moment. "The mountains are trying to tell us something," Margaret explained to Richard as they began their journey upward. He was more skeptical of such things, preferring logical explanations to his wife's spiritual insights, but years of experience had taught him to respect her intuition. Something in her voice today carried an authority that brooked no argument. In the clearing, Emily had begun to feel more at ease with her unusual companion. The bear's presence was steady and reassuring, filling the void left by Rachel's departure. When a distant sound echoed through the trees, something that might have been threatening, the bear rose to its full height, positioning itself between Emily and the potential danger. Its powerful roar reverberated through the mountain air, sending a clear message to any who might approach with ill intent. The mountain winds seemed to carry messages that only Margaret could interpret as she and Richard made their way up the familiar trails. Each gust seemed to whisper urgently, guiding them toward their destination. Richard noticed how his wife would pause at certain points, head tilted, as if listening to voices only she could hear, before choosing their next path with unwavering certainty. Emily's world, usually defined by sounds and textures, had expanded to include the protective presence of the bear. She could feel its massive form shifting around her, always maintaining its guardian position. The creature's behavior was unlike anything natural history would suggest. This was no ordinary encounter between human and wild animal. There was purpose in the bear's actions, an almost supernatural awareness of its role in this unfolding drama. As the morning progressed, the mountain seemed to hold its breath, watching over this unlikely pair, a blind child and her ursine protector, while Margaret and Richard climbed ever higher, guided by an ancient wisdom that flowed through the very rocks beneath their feet. The Adirondacks had chosen their guardian well, ensuring that Emily would not face her abandonment alone. Margaret and Richard's ascent up the mountain grew more challenging as they progressed. The morning rain had begun to fall in a fine mist, making the ground treacherously slippery. Yet they pressed on, driven by Margaret's unwavering certainty that something was terribly wrong. The couple moved with determination, their years of experience on these trails evident in every calculated step. "Look," Margaret called out suddenly, pointing to a small piece of fabric caught on a branch. Richard moved closer, his heart sinking as he recognized the material from Emily's jacket. This physical evidence confirmed their worst fears and gave new urgency to their climb. The discovery seemed to energize Margaret, who had been right to trust her intuitive connection to the mountain. Meanwhile, Rachel's situation had grown increasingly desperate. The path she thought she knew so well had become a maze of unfamiliar turns and dead ends. Even the trees seemed different, more densely packed than she remembered, their branches reaching out like accusing fingers. The map she had found in the cabin offered little help. as the trails it showed appeared to shift and change every time she consulted it. Inside the abandoned cabin she had discovered, Rachel had found more than just the map. The recent footprints in the dust and the still-functioning lantern spoke of someone's presence, but who would venture this far into the mountain's embrace? The markings on the map, especially the mysterious X leading to the clearing where she had left Emily, filled her with an inexplicable dread. As she studied the cabin's interior more closely, Rachel noticed other unsettling details. The walls bore strange markings that seemed to tell a story, one of the mountain's ancient role as protector of the innocent. These symbols, weathered by time, appeared to watch her every move, judging the choices she had made. The weight of her actions pressed down on her with each passing moment. Back on the mountain trail, Margaret and Richard encountered increasingly difficult terrain. The path seemed to test them, presenting obstacles that required all their experience to overcome. Margaret felt that the mountain itself was evaluating their worthiness, measuring their determination to reach Emily. She shared this thought with Richard, who, despite his usual skepticism, found himself unable to dismiss the notion entirely. "The mountain has always protected those who deserve it," Margaret said softly, recalling ancient stories passed down through generations. Richard squeezed her hand in response, understanding that his wife's connection to these peaks went beyond mere familiarity. Their shared concern for Emily drove them forward, even as the mist thickened around them. Rachel's descent continued to be plagued by confusion and mounting fear. Each attempt to find a familiar landmark led her further astray. The forest sounds had changed too, taking on an almost accusatory tone. The wind that whistled through the trees seemed to carry whispers of judgment, and the ground beneath her feet felt unstable, as if the mountain itself was rejecting her presence. The map she had taken from the cabin now seemed more like a curse than a help. Its markings appeared to mock her attempts to navigate, showing paths that vanished when she tried to follow them. The X marking the clearing where Emily waited seemed to grow darker each time Rachel looked at it, a constant reminder of what she had done. Margaret and Richard pressed on, their determination growing stronger with each step. The discovery of Emily's jacket fragment had transformed their worry into focused action. Margaret led the way, seeming to follow signs that only she could perceive. A broken twig here, a disturbed patch of earth there. Her connection to the mountain appeared to strengthen as they climbed higher, as if nature itself was guiding them toward their granddaughter. The mist continued to thicken, but it didn't hamper Margaret's sense of direction. If anything, it seemed to enhance her ability to read the mountain's signals. Richard watched in amazement as his wife navigated the increasingly challenging terrain with unwavering certainty, her steps guided by something beyond physical markers. As they climbed higher, the mountain's presence became more palpable. The very air seemed charged with purpose, the wind carrying messages that Margaret somehow understood. Their journey had taken on the quality of a test, one that would determine their worthiness to reach Emily. The mountain, ancient and wise, watched their progress with the patience of centuries, its secrets slowly unfolding before those who proved themselves worthy of its trust. In the clearing atop the mountain, Emily had found an unexpected sense of security in the presence of her unusual protector. The bear's massive form remained vigilant beside her, its warmth providing comfort against the morning chill. Her distant sound echoed through the trees, something that might have been threatening, causing the bear to rise to its full height, positioning itself protectively between Emily and the potential danger. The bear's powerful roar reverberated through the mountain air, the sound carrying far beyond the clearing. It was more than just a warning. It was a declaration of protection, a clear message to anything or anyone that might approach with ill intent. Emily, despite her inability to see, could feel the power in that sound, yet she remained remarkably calm, sensing the bear's intention to keep her safe. Meanwhile, Rachel's journey down the mountain had become increasingly difficult. The trails seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways, leading her back to the same spots no matter which direction she chose. Branches appeared to reach out and snag her clothing, and the ground beneath her feet felt unstable in places that should have been solid. The map from the cabin had become more confusing than helpful, its markings seeming to shift whenever she looked away. The sound of the bear's roar reached Rachel in her wanderings, causing her to freeze in her tracks. The power in that sound made her blood run cold, not just from fear of the creature itself, but from the realization that she had left Emily alone in a wilderness where such beasts roamed. For the first time since beginning her descent, real regret began to seep into her consciousness. Back in the clearing, Emily had begun to understand the bear's movements and sounds. When it growled low in its throat, she knew it was responding to distant noises that her human ears couldn't detect. The massive creature maintained a constant circuit around her, its paw steps creating a protective perimeter. Despite her young age, Emily sensed that this was no ordinary wild animal. There was purpose and intelligence in its actions. Rachel's attempts to find her way down continued to be thwarted at every turn. The cabin she had discovered earlier now seemed to mock her, appearing in different locations as if it could move through the forest at will. Each time she thought she had found a familiar path, it would lead her in circles, bringing her back to places she was certain she had left behind. Inside the cabin, during one of her desperate attempts to reorient herself, Rachel discovered more disturbing details. The map on the wall showed trails that seemed to appear and disappear as she watched, and the markings that led to Emily's clearing grew more prominent with each viewing. The lantern's light cast shadows that danced across the walls, forming shapes that seemed to tell stories of the mountain's ancient role as protector of the innocent. Emily, still in her clearing, had begun to feel more at ease with her situation. The bear's presence brought a sense of security she hadn't expected to find after Rachel's departure. When the wind carried unusual sounds, the bear would respond with a warning growl or another powerful roar, establishing its dominion over this part of the mountain. Each time the creature demonstrated its protective nature, Emily felt more certain that she was meant to be exactly where she was. The morning had progressed, and the mountain seemed to have taken sides in this unfolding drama. While Emily found protection under the bear's watchful guard, Rachel found herself increasingly trapped in a maze of her own making. The paths that should have led her to safety seemed to conspire against her, as if the mountain itself was passing judgment on her actions. Through it all, the bear remained steadfast in its protection of Emily. When distant voices carried on the wind, the creature would position itself strategically, its massive body creating a living shield between Emily and any potential threat. The little girl had begun to reach out occasionally to touch its fur, finding comfort in its solid presence and warmth. Together they created an unlikely tableau, a blind child and her ursine guardian, watched over by an ancient mountain that seemed to have awakened to ensure justice would prevail. Margaret and Richard's ascent had taken on an almost ceremonial quality. Each step seemed guided by an unseen force, with Margaret leading the way through the increasingly challenging terrain. The fine rain continued to fall, creating a misty veil that somehow enhanced Margaret's ability to sense their correct path. She moved with growing certainty, as if the mountain itself was revealing its secrets to her. There, Margaret pointed to another sign, fresh marks on the ground that couldn't have been made by small wildlife. Richard examined them closely, his practical mind trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The tracks were large, much larger than any human footprint, and they seemed to be moving in the same direction they were heading. Something about them made Margaret's heart beat faster, not with fear, but with a strange sense of hope. Richard watched his wife navigate the difficult terrain with growing amazement. In all their years of marriage, he had learned to respect her unique connection to these mountains, but today was different. There was an urgency in her movements, a certainty in her steps that spoke of something beyond mere intuition. She seemed to be following signs that only she could perceive, guided by an ancient wisdom that flowed through the very rocks beneath their feet. Meanwhile, Rachel had found herself back at the mysterious cabin for what felt like the 100th time. The structure seemed to appear whenever she thought she had finally found a way down the mountain, as if deliberately blocking her escape routes. Inside, the map on the wall continued to taunt her, its markings shifting and changing, always showing the path back to the clearing where she had left Emily. The lantern in the cabin cast eerie shadows on the walls, its light revealing more details each time Rachel entered. There were markings etched into the wooden beams, symbols that seemed to tell stories of the mountain's guardians and their role in protecting the innocent. With each visit to the cabin, the weight of what she had done pressed more heavily on her conscience. Back in the clearing, Emily remained under the watchful protection of the bear. The massive creature, had settled into a pattern of vigilant guardianship, responding to distant sounds with warning growls or positioning itself between Emily and potential threats. The little girl had grown increasingly comfortable with her unusual protector, finding security in its constant presence and warmth. Margaret and Richard's climb brought them to a section of the trail where the mist seemed to part slightly, revealing glimpses of the path ahead. Margaret paused, her hand reaching out to touch the trunk of an ancient tree. "The mountain is guiding us," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of centuries of wisdom. Richard, typically skeptical of such statements, found himself unable to deny the strange energy that seemed to pulse through the very air around them. Rachel's attempts to escape the mountain's grasp grew more desperate with each passing hour. The paths she chose seemed to twist back on themselves, leading her in circles or bringing her back to the cabin. The wind had taken on an accusatory tone, whispering through the trees in ways that seemed to judge her actions. Each step she took seemed to be countered by the mountain itself, as if nature was ensuring she would face the consequences of her choices. The morning had aged, and with it, the mountain's purpose seemed to grow clearer. Margaret and Richard found themselves following a trail that showed increasing signs of recent passage. Broken twigs, disturbed earth, and those mysterious large tracks that Margaret somehow knew would lead them to Emily. The mountain air carried sounds that grew more distinct as they climbed higher. Among them, what seemed to be the distant roar of a large animal. Through the mist, Margaret and Richard could make out the shapes of trees that seemed to bend and sway, creating a natural pathway forward. The mountain's presence felt more tangible with each step, its ancient energy guiding them toward their goal. Margaret's connection to these peaks had never been stronger, as if the very essence of the mountain was working through her to ensure justice would prevail. The paths beneath their feet seemed to solidify, providing sure footing where moments before the ground had been treacherous. It was as if the mountain itself was choosing sides in this unfolding drama, aiding those who sought to right a wrong while hindering those who had caused harm. The Adirondacks, ancient and wise, were revealing their true nature as protectors of the innocent, their power manifesting through both the physical realm and the spiritual connection that Margaret had always honored. The morning mist began to thin as Margaret and Richard approached the higher reaches of the mountain. The air grew charged with an inexplicable energy that made both of them pause momentarily. Ahead, through the clearing fog, they could make out what appeared to be a natural plateau. Margaret's steps became more purposeful, guided by an instinct she couldn't explain but completely trusted. "Listen," Margaret whispered, holding up her hand. Through the mountain air came a sound that made their hearts stop. Emily's voice carried on the wind, not crying or distressed, but speaking softly to someone or something. But it was what they heard next that made them freeze in their tracks, the low, rumbling response of something large and powerful. As they edged closer, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush, the scene that unfolded before them defied all logical explanation. There, in a small clearing, sat Emily, their blind 5-year-old granddaughter, and beside her, massive and vigilant, stood a bear. The creature's posture was unlike anything they had ever seen, not threatening but protective, its huge body positioned like a living shield around the little girl. Richard instinctively moved to rush forward, but Margaret's hand on his arm held him back. Her years of connection with these mountains had taught her to read situations that went beyond normal understanding. The bear was not a threat. It was a guardian, chosen by the mountain itself to protect an innocent child. Emily sat peacefully, one small hand resting on the bear's thick fur, completely at ease with her unusual protector. The massive animal's head turned slightly at Margaret and Richard's approach, but instead of showing aggression, it seemed to be evaluating their presence as if measuring their intentions. Margaret took a careful step forward, her voice gentle as she called out, "Emily, sweetheart." The bear's ears twitched at the sound, but it made no threatening move. Instead, it watched with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural as Emily's face lit up with recognition at the sound of her grandmother's voice. "Grandma," Emily called out, her face turning toward the sound. "The mountain sent me a friend. He's been keeping me safe." The simplicity and truth in her words struck Margaret deeply. Even at her young age, Emily understood what many adults never would: the deep connection between nature's guardians and those they chose to protect. The bear shifted its position slightly, making a sound deep in its throat that was neither threatening nor fearful. It was almost as if the creature was acknowledging Margaret's right to approach, recognizing in her the same connection to the mountain that had drawn it to protect Emily. Richard watched in amazement as his wife slowly crossed the clearing, her movements calm and deliberate. The bear's eyes followed her progress, but its posture remained relaxed. When Margaret finally reached Emily, the bear simply took a few steps back, maintaining its protective presence while allowing the family reunion. The morning light strengthened, breaking through the last of the mist, illuminating the clearing in a way that seemed almost otherworldly. The bear remained nearby, its role as guardian not yet complete. There was something in its demeanor that suggested it was waiting, perhaps knowing that this drama had not yet fully played out. Margaret held Emily close, feeling the child's complete lack of fear or distress. "He kept me safe, Grandma," Emily explained, gesturing toward the bear. "When I heard scary sounds, he would make them go away. He's been here the whole time." The bear rumbled softly in response, as if confirming Emily's words. Richard had joined them now, moving slowly and respectfully through the clearing. The bear watched him approach, seemingly satisfied with his presence as well. The family stood together, surrounded by the ancient energy of the mountain, while their unlikely guardian maintained its vigil. The scene painted a picture of nature's profound wisdom. A bear, typically feared as a dangerous predator, chosen by the mountain to protect a vulnerable child. It stood as testimony to something Margaret had always known, that these mountains held secrets and powers that went far beyond human understanding, stepping in when necessary to protect those deemed worthy of their care. Rachel's desperate wandering had finally brought her full circle. After hours of finding herself led back to the mysterious cabin time and again, the mountain path suddenly seemed to clear, guiding her upward with an inevitability she couldn't resist. Each step felt heavy with the weight of her actions. The map from the cabin now clutched uselessly in her trembling hands. The sounds that reached her ears made her pause, voices carried on the wind, familiar yet somehow changed by the mountain air. She recognized Margaret's gentle tone, Richard's deeper timbre, and then, unmistakably, Emily's clear young voice. The sound of the child she had abandoned sent a shock of shame through her body, forcing her to confront the reality of what she had done. As Rachel emerged from the tree line into the clearing, the scene before her stopped her in her tracks. There stood Margaret and Richard, protectively close to Emily, but it was the fourth figure in the clearing that made her blood run cold. The massive bear stood nearby, its presence both magnificent and terrifying. The creature's eyes turned to focus on her, and in that gaze, Rachel felt the weight of judgment more powerful than any human court could deliver. Emily, sensing the change in the atmosphere, turned her head toward the sound of Rachel's approach. "Rachel!" she called out, her voice carrying neither fear nor anger, only a simple question. The bear shifted its weight, moving slightly closer to Emily, its role as protector clear in every movement. Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law with eyes that held more sadness than anger. "The mountain brought you back," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of ancient understanding. Richard stood silent, his expression a mixture of disappointment and disbelief as he looked at the woman who had abandoned his granddaughter. Rachel found herself unable to move forward or retreat. The map in her hands suddenly felt like it was burning, its mysterious markings a testimony to the mountain's power to guide and mislead, to protect and punish. I got lost," she stammered, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "The trails kept changing, leading me back to this old cabin." "The cabin has stood here for generations," Margaret interrupted softly, appearing to those who need its message most. "The mountain chooses who finds it and when." Her words carried the weight of generations of wisdom, of stories passed down about the mountain's role as judge and protector. The bear watched this exchange with an almost human intelligence, its massive form a reminder of nature's power to intervene when necessary. Emily stood protected between her grandparents, one hand still occasionally reaching out to touch the bear's fur, completely at ease with her unlikely guardian. Rachel's composure began to crack under the weight of what she faced. I wasn't, she tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. The morning's events played through her mind, her calculated plan to abandon Emily, her desperate attempts to escape the mountain, the cabin's mysterious appearances, and now this final confrontation under the watchful eyes of both her human family and this powerful creature of the wild. The clearing held a heavy silence, broken only by the whisper of wind through the trees. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting everything in a clear, unforgiving light. Rachel could see the piece of Emily's jacket that had torn off during their ascent, still caught on a nearby branch, evidence of her calculated betrayal. Margaret stepped forward, her voice carrying the strength of the mountain itself. "These peaks have their own wisdom," she said, gesturing to the bear that had protected Emily. "They know who deserves their protection and who must face their judgment. The mountain brought you back here for a reason, Rachel. It's time to face what you've done." The bear rumbled deep in its throat, not threatening but affirming, as if adding its voice to Margaret's words. Emily, still holding onto her grandmother's hand, turned her face toward Rachel with an expression that somehow held both innocence and understanding, far beyond her years. The mountain winds seemed to gather around them, carrying the weight of centuries of similar judgments, of nature's eternal role in protecting those who needed it most. The clearing held a tense silence as Rachel stood before the group, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like a physical force. The mysterious map from the cabin trembled in her hands, its markings seeming to mock her failed attempt to escape the mountain's judgment. The bear maintained its protective stance near Emily, its presence a powerful reminder of nature's intervention. "I never wanted this responsibility," Rachel finally spoke, her voice breaking. "Taking care of a child with special needs, it wasn't part of my plan." The words hung in the air, their selfishness laid bare in the morning light. Emily's face remained turned toward the sound of Rachel's voice, her expression showing a wisdom and understanding that made Rachel's excuses seem even more hollow. Margaret stepped forward, her connection to the mountain evident in her steady movements. "The mountain has its own way of revealing truth," she said, gesturing to their surroundings. "It led you in circles, brought you to the cabin, showed you signs you couldn't ignore. Every step was a chance to change your mind, to make things right." The bear shifted slightly, its massive form casting a shadow across the clearing. Rachel couldn't help but stare at the creature that had taken on the role she had abandoned. The irony wasn't lost on her. A wild animal had shown more compassion and responsibility than she had. "The cabin kept appearing," Rachel continued, her composure crumbling. "No matter which path I took, it was there with its map and its markings. I tried to find my way down, but the mountain, it wouldn't let me leave." Her voice trailed off as she realized how the mountain had orchestrated every moment, ensuring she would face the consequences of her actions. Richard, who had remained silent until now, spoke with controlled anger. "You planned this," he said, his voice tight. "You brought her up here with the intention of leaving her. How could you think this was acceptable?" The bear rumbled in response to his anger, not threateningly, but as if adding its own judgment to his words. Emily's small voice cut through the tension. "The mountain sent me a friend," she said simply, reaching out to touch the bear's fur. "He stayed with me, protected me. He knew I needed help." Her words carried no accusation, but they struck Rachel like physical blows, highlighting the contrast between her abandonment and nature's protection. Rachel looked at the map again, its mysterious X marking the clearing where they now stood. "I found this in the cabin," she explained, her voice shaking. "But every time I tried to use it to leave, the paths changed. It was like the mountain itself was keeping me here, making sure I couldn't escape what I'd done." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding flowing from her deep connection to these ancient peaks. "The mountain has always been a protector of the innocent," she said, her voice carrying the weight of generations of wisdom. "The cabin appears to those who need its message most. The map shows what you need to see, not always what you want to find." The morning sun had risen higher, casting long shadows through the trees. The bear remained vigilant, its presence a living embodiment of the mountain's protective nature. Emily stood between her grandparents, safe and calm, while Rachel faced the full impact of her failed plan. "I convinced myself it was the right thing to do," Rachel admitted, tears finally breaking through her composure. "I told myself everyone would be better off. But the mountain, it showed me how wrong I was. Every path led me back here, forced me to see what I'd done." The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the ancient wisdom of the mountains. The clearing had become a natural courtroom, with the bear as guardian, the mountain as judge, and nature itself as witness to Rachel's confession. Her carefully constructed justifications crumbled in the face of simple truths. A child's trust betrayed, a wild creature's natural compassion, and a mountain's undeniable power to reveal what truly lies in human hearts. The clearing seemed to hold its breath as Rachel's confession hung in the air. The morning light filtered through the canopy above, creating patterns that danced across the ground like nature's own commentary on the unfolding drama. The bear remained steadfast near Emily, its presence a constant reminder of the mountain's choice to protect those deemed worthy. The trails, Rachel continued, her voice barely above a whisper, they kept changing. Every time I thought I found a way down, they led me back to that cabin. The map showed paths that appeared and disappeared, always bringing me back here. She looked at the marked paper in her hands, now crumpled from her desperate journey. Margaret nodded slowly, her deep understanding of the mountain's ways evident in her expression. These peaks have protected the innocent for generations, she explained, her voice carrying the weight of ancient knowledge. The cabin appears only to those who need its message most. Some find shelter there, others find truth they've been avoiding. Emily stood quietly between her grandparents, one hand still occasionally reaching out to touch the bear's fur. The massive creature had become more than just a protector. It was a living symbol of the mountain's judgment, choosing to guard an abandoned child while helping to expose the truth of Rachel's actions. I thought I was making the right choice, Rachel said, her carefully constructed justifications crumbling in the face of nature's intervention. Emily's needs, they were more than I wanted to handle. I convinced myself everyone would be better off, but the mountain, she gestured helplessly at their surroundings, at the paths that had refused to let her escape. Richard watched his daughter-in-law with a mixture of anger and disbelief. You planned this, he stated again, the words heavy with disappointment. You chose this spot, led her up here knowing what you intended to do. The bear rumbled deeply at his words, as if affirming the gravity of Rachel's premeditated actions. The wind picked up suddenly, rustling through the trees with an almost musical quality. Emily tilted her head, listening to the sound with the acute sensitivity she had developed to compensate for her lack of sight. The mountain is singing, she said simply, her young voice carrying an wisdom that made the adults fall silent. Margaret moved closer to her granddaughter, understanding flowing between them. Yes, sweetheart, she agreed softly. The mountain has its own voice, its own way of speaking to those who know how to listen. She looked pointedly at Rachel, who had experienced firsthand how the mountain could communicate its will. The map in Rachel's hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Every marking on it seemed to highlight her failures, as a stepmother, as a guardian, as a human being. The mysterious X that had led her back to this clearing now appeared to be less of a destination and more of a judgment, a point where truth could no longer be avoided. I found footprints in the cabin, Rachel admitted, her voice shaking. Signs that someone had been there recently. The lantern was still working, and there were these symbols on the walls. She trailed off, remembering how the markings had seemed to watch her, to judge her actions with the wisdom of ages. The bear shifted its position slightly, moving to stand between Emily and Rachel, its protective instinct still evident, even as the truth came to light. The creature's behavior continued to defy natural explanation. This was no ordinary wild animal, but a chosen guardian, selected by the mountain itself to protect an innocent child. Emily's voice cut through the tension again, clear and without accusation. He knew I needed help, she said, referring to the bear. Just like the mountain knew, they kept me safe when... She didn't finish the sentence, but her words struck Rachel like physical blows, highlighting the contrast between human betrayal and nature's unwavering protection. The morning had deepened, and with it, the mountain's presence seemed to grow stronger. The clearing they stood in had become more than just a physical space. It was now a place of revelation, where the truth could no longer hide in shadows. The bear maintained its vigilant stance near Emily, its massive form a living reminder of nature's choice to protect the innocent. I kept trying to justify it to myself, Rachel spoke, her voice heavy with realization. Every step up this trail I told myself it was necessary, But the mountain. She looked around at the paths that had refused to let her escape, at the mysterious cabin that had appeared again and again. The mountain wouldn't let me hide from what I was doing. Margaret watched her daughter-in-law with eyes that held generations of understanding about these ancient peaks. The mountain has always known how to guide those who are lost, she said, her voice carrying the weight of inherited wisdom. Sometimes it guides them to safety, and sometimes, she glanced meaningfully at Rachel, it guides them to truth they've been avoiding. The bear shifted slightly, letting out a low rumble that seemed to emphasize Margaret's words. Emily reached out instinctively toward the sound, her small hand finding the creature's fur with familiar ease. The bond between the child and her unlikely protector had grown stronger with each passing hour, a living testament to the mountain's intervention. When I found the cabin, Rachel continued, her composure cracking further, I thought it would help me escape. Instead, every mark on that map, every symbol on those walls, they all led me back here, back to face what I'd done. The paper in her hands trembled, its mysterious markings now seeming more like accusations than directions. Richard stood protectively close to Emily, his anger at Rachel tempered by disbelief at the morning's events. The sight of his blind granddaughter so completely at ease with a wild bear, the mysterious cabin that had haunted Rachel's descent, the mountain's apparent determination to bring truth to light, it all challenged his usually practical worldview. Emily's voice carried through the clearing, clear and innocent. The mountain knew, she said simply. It knew I needed a friend when Rachel left. That's why it sent him to me. She gestured toward the bear, her words free from accusation, but powerful in their truth. The bear responded with a gentle rumble, as if confirming her understanding. The wind moved through the trees with renewed purpose, creating sounds that seemed almost like whispers. Margaret nodded slowly, recognizing the mountain's voice in the rustling leaves. These peaks have their own wisdom, she explained. They've watched over this land for centuries, protecting those who deserve protection, revealing truths that need to be known. Rachel found herself unable to look away from the bear, the creature that had stepped in to protect Emily when she had chosen to abandon her. The irony was overwhelming. A wild animal had shown more compassion, more responsibility than she had managed to find in herself. The mountain had chosen its guardian well, sending not just a protector, but a living rebuke to Rachel's actions. I found footprints in the cabin, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. The lantern was still lit, like someone had just been there. But every time I tried to follow the paths away from here, they changed. The mountain kept bringing me back, making me see. She trailed off, the weight of her actions finally fully settling on her shoulders. The clearing held them all in its embrace. Emily with her bear protector, Margaret and Richard standing guard over their granddaughter, and Rachel facing the consequences of her choices. The mountain's presence was palpable now, its ancient wisdom flowing through every breath of wind, every rustle of leaves, every rumble from the bear that had become its chosen guardian. A profound silence had fallen over the clearing as the weight of Rachel's confessions settled around them. The morning sun had risen higher, casting dappled shadows through the canopy above, as if nature itself was witnessing this moment of truth. The bear remained steadfast in its protective position near Emily, its presence a constant reminder of the mountain's intervention. Each time I tried to leave, Rachel continued, her voice thick with emotion, the paths seemed to change. The cabin would appear out of nowhere, always with that map showing the way back here. She looked down at the crumpled paper in her hands, its mysterious markings now seeming less like a map and more like the mountain's own handwriting, spelling out the truth she had tried to escape. Margaret moved closer to Emily, watching as her granddaughter continued to find comfort in the bear's presence. The mountain has always been more than just rock and earth, she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of generations. It's a guardian in its own right, choosing how and when to reveal its power. She gazed meaningfully at the bear, acknowledging the creature's role in this morning's events. The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the trees with an almost musical quality. Emily tilted her head, listening intently. The mountain is talking again, she said softly, her young voice filled with understanding that belied her years. The bear rumbled gently in response, as if confirming her words. Richard watched the scene unfold, his practical nature struggling to reconcile what he was witnessing. The bear's behavior defied everything he knew about wild animals, yet here it stood, a gentle giant protecting his granddaughter. The mountain's intervention, through changed paths, mysterious cabins, and this unlikely guardian, was impossible to deny. "I told myself it was for the best," Rachel said, her carefully constructed justifications crumbling in the face of nature's judgment. "I convinced myself that everyone would be better off if—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the reality of what she had planned to do finally hitting her with full force. The bear shifted slightly, positioning itself more firmly between Emily and Rachel, its role as protector clear in every movement. Emily reached out instinctively, her small hand finding the creature's fur with familiar ease. The trust between them was remarkable, a bond formed through the mountain's wisdom in choosing its guardian. "The symbols in the cabin," Rachel continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "they seemed to watch me, to judge every step I took. The lantern that stayed lit, the footprints that looked fresh. Everything was pushing me to face what I'd done." She looked around the clearing, seeing it now through new eyes, not as a place of abandonment, but as a place of revelation. Margaret nodded slowly, understanding flowing from her deep connection to these ancient peaks. "The mountain shows us what we need to see," she said, "not always what we want to see. It guided you back here because this is where the truth needed to come out." Her words carried no judgment, only acceptance of the mountain's wisdom. Emily's voice cut through the heavy atmosphere once again. "He knew I was scared at first," she said, referring to the bear, "but he showed me I was safe. He made the scary sounds go away." Her simple description of the bear's protection struck Rachel deeply, highlighting the contrast between her own actions and nature's compassion. The clearing held them all in its embrace, the abandoned child who had found protection in nature's unlikely guardian, the grandparents whose connection to the mountain had guided them true, and the woman whose attempts to escape responsibility had been thwarted by ancient powers beyond her understanding. The mountain's presence was undeniable now, its wisdom flowing through every aspect of this unfolding drama. The clearing had become a sacred space where truth and nature intertwined. The morning light filtered through the trees differently now, as if the mountain itself was illuminating the path forward. The bear maintained its protective stance near Emily, its presence a continuous reminder of the natural world's capacity for compassion. Margaret stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of understanding that came from years of living in harmony with these ancient peaks. "The mountain has shown us all something today," she said, looking from Rachel to the bear, then to Emily. "It showed us how nature steps in when humans fail, how wisdom can come from unexpected sources." The wind whispered through the trees, creating a sound that seemed almost like voices. Emily listened intently, her face turned toward the breeze. "The mountain sounds different now," she observed, her young voice filled with insight. "It's not angry anymore." The bear rumbled softly in agreement, its deep sound harmonizing with the wind's whispers. Rachel looked down at the mysterious map in her hands, seeing it now as something more than just paper and markings. "Every time I tried to escape," she said, her voice trembling, "the paths led me back here. The cabin appeared wherever I turned, like it was following me, making sure I couldn't run from what I'd done." Richard watched the bear with newfound respect, his practical nature finally accepting what his eyes were seeing. The creature's behavior went beyond any natural explanation. This was something else entirely, a deliberate choice made by forces older than human understanding. The way it protected Emily, responded to her voice, maintained its vigilant guard. It all spoke of purpose rather than instinct. "When I first found the cabin," Rachel continued, her words coming easier now, "I thought it was just an abandoned structure. But the lantern was lit, the map was there, and those symbols on the walls—" She paused, remembering. "They seemed to tell stories about the mountain's guardians, about protection and justice." The bear shifted slightly, its massive form moving with surprising grace as it adjusted its position near Emily. The child reached out automatically, her small hand finding the creature's fur with familiar ease. Their connection had grown stronger through the morning, a living testament to the mountain's wisdom in choosing its guardian. Margaret nodded slowly, recognition flowing through her. "These peaks have their own way of setting things right," she said. "The cabin appears to those who need its message most. Some find shelter there, others find truth they've been avoiding, and some—" She looked meaningfully at Rachel. Find they cannot escape their own actions. Emily's voice carried through the clearing, clear and innocent. The mountain knew what to do, she said simply. It sent me a friend when I needed one most. The bear rumbled in response, a sound that seemed to carry both affection and protection. The creature's eyes, intelligent and aware, watched the group with an understanding that went beyond animal instinct. The morning had deepened, and with it, the mountain's presence seemed to grow stronger. The clearing they stood in had become more than just a physical space. It was now a place of revelation, where truth could no longer hide in shadows. The paths that had confused Rachel, the cabin that had appeared and reappeared, the bear that had chosen to protect, all of it spoke to something greater at work. Rachel found herself unable to look away from the scene before her. Emily, safe and calm beside her massive protector, Margaret and Richard standing guard, and the mountain itself seeming to watch over them all. The weight of her actions pressed down on her, but now it felt less like judgment and more like understanding. The mountain had brought her back not just for punishment, but for revelation. The clearing held them all in its ancient embrace as the morning light strengthened, casting long shadows through the trees. The bear remained steadfast in its protective position near Emily, its presence a living bridge between the natural world and human drama unfolding before it. The mountain's energy seemed to pulse through the ground beneath their feet, guiding events toward their inevitable conclusion. The cabin kept appearing, Rachel said, breaking the thoughtful silence that had fallen over the group. No matter which way I turned, it was there, with its lantern still burning and that map showing the way back here. She held up the mysterious document, its markings now seeming to shift in the dappled sunlight. It was like the mountain wouldn't let me escape until I faced what I'd done. Margaret moved closer to Emily, watching as her granddaughter continued to find comfort in the bear's presence. These mountains have witnessed countless stories over the centuries, she said, her voice carrying the weight of inherited wisdom. They know when to intervene, when to protect those who need protection most. The bear rumbled softly, as if confirming her words. Emily's hand remained buried in the bear's thick fur, her face peaceful despite the tension around her. He makes me feel safe, she said simply, referring to her unlikely guardian. When I heard scary sounds, he would roar and make them go away. He didn't leave me alone like... Her voice trailed off, but the unspoken comparison hung in the air. Richard watched the scene with growing understanding. His practical nature had initially resisted the idea of supernatural intervention, but the evidence before him was undeniable. The bear's behavior defied natural explanation. Its gentle protection of Emily, its intelligent responses to their conversation, its clearly purposeful actions throughout the morning. I found fresh footprints in the cabin, Rachel continued, her voice quieter now, and symbols on the walls that seemed to tell stories about the mountain's guardians. At first I thought I was imagining things, but now... She looked at the bear, understanding finally dawning in her eyes. Now I see that the mountain was trying to show me something important. The wind moved through the trees with renewed purpose, creating sounds that seemed almost like whispers. Emily tilted her head, listening intently. The mountain is saying something, she observed, her young voice filled with wisdom beyond her years. The bear shifted slightly, its massive head turning toward the sound as if it too understood the mountain's voice. Margaret nodded slowly, recognition flowing through her. The mountain speaks to those who know how to listen, she said. It guided us here when we felt something was wrong. It sent this guardian to protect Emily when she needed it most. And it brought you back, Rachel, when you tried to run from the truth. The clearing seemed to hold its breath as Rachel's carefully constructed justifications continued to crumble. The morning's events played through her mind, her calculated plan to abandon Emily, her desperate attempts to escape, the cabin's mysterious appearances, and now this final confrontation under the watchful eyes of both her human family and this powerful creature of the wild. Emily's voice cut through the heavy atmosphere once again. The mountain is wise, she said with childlike simplicity. It knows who needs help and who deserves it. The bear rumbled in agreement, its deep sound echoing through the clearing like nature's own affirmation of her words. The morning had aged into a pristine day, the sun now high above the ancient peaks of the Adirondacks. In the clearing, the air seemed charged with an energy that spoke of imminent resolution. The bear maintained its vigilant stance near Emily, its role as protector unchanged, despite the shifting dynamics among the humans before it. Rachel stood at the edge of the clearing, the mysterious map still clutched in her trembling hands. "All those times the cabin appeared," she said, her voice heavy with realization. "It wasn't just showing me the way back. It was showing me what I'd become, someone who needed to be guided back to their humanity." Margaret watched her daughter-in-law with eyes that held generations of mountain wisdom. "The cabin has always appeared to those who need its message most," she said softly. "Some find shelter there, others find truth. You found something you'd been trying to avoid, a mirror to your own actions." The bear shifted slightly, its massive form moving with surprising grace as it adjusted its position near Emily. The child's hand remained buried in its thick fur, finding comfort in its steady presence. Their connection had become a living testament to the mountain's wisdom in choosing its guardians. "I thought I was making the right choice," Rachel continued, her carefully constructed justifications finally crumbling completely. "I told myself that everyone would be better off, that Emily's needs were too much for me to handle. But the mountain—" She gestured helplessly at their surroundings. "The mountain showed me what real care and protection look like." Emily's face turned toward the sound of Rachel's voice, her expression showing an understanding far beyond her years. "The mountain knew," she said simply. "It knew I needed someone to stay with me to keep me safe. That's why it sent him." The bear rumbled softly in response, its deep sound carrying both affection and protection. Richard stepped forward, his practical nature finally fully accepting what he was witnessing. "All these years," he said, looking at Margaret, "I never quite believed your stories about the mountain's power. But now—" He glanced at the bear, at Emily's complete comfort with the massive creature, at the evidence of the mountain's intervention in every aspect of the morning's events. The wind moved through the trees with renewed purpose, creating sounds that seemed to carry messages. Margaret nodded slowly, recognizing the mountain's voice in the rustling leaves. "These peaks have their own wisdom," she explained. "They've watched over this land for centuries, protecting those who deserve protection, teaching those who need to learn." Rachel looked down at the map once more, seeing it now as something more than just paper and markings. Every line, every symbol seemed to tell the story of her journey, not just the physical path she had taken, but the spiritual one as well. The cabin's repeated appearances, the changing trails, the mysterious footprints, all of it had been leading her to this moment of truth. "When I first left Emily here," Rachel admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "I felt relief. But with each step I took, trying to escape, that relief turned to something else. The mountain wouldn't let me hide from what I was doing. It kept bringing me back, making me see—" The bear's presence seemed to grow stronger as Rachel spoke, its role as both protector and judge becoming clearer with each passing moment. It stood as a living embodiment of the mountain's will, a guardian chosen not just to protect Emily, but to show Rachel the true meaning of responsibility and care. The clearing had become a sanctuary of truth as the day continued to unfold. The bear's presence remained constant, its protective stance near Emily unchanged, even as the tension in the air began to shift toward resolution. The mountain's energy seemed to pulse through the ground beneath their feet, guiding them all toward understanding. Margaret stood in the center of the clearing, her connection to these ancient peaks more evident than ever. "The mountain has shown us all something today," she said, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "It showed us how nature steps in when humans fail, how wisdom can come from the most unexpected sources, and how truth always finds its way to the surface." The wind moved through the trees with purpose, creating a melody that seemed to speak directly to their hearts. Emily listened intently, her face turned toward the sound. "The mountain isn't angry anymore," she observed quietly. "It sounds peaceful now." The bear rumbled softly in agreement, its deep sound harmonizing with the wind's whispers. Rachel looked at the map in her hands one final time before letting it fall to the ground. "Every path I took led me back here," she said, her voice steady now. "No matter how hard I tried to escape, the mountain knew where I needed to be. The cabin, the changing trails, the footprints that seemed to follow me. It was all guiding me back to face what I'd done." Richard moved closer to his wife and granddaughter, watching in amazement as Emily continued to find comfort in the bear's presence. The massive creature's behavior defied everything he knew about wild animals, yet here it stood, gentle and protective, a living testament to the mountain's intervention. "When I first found the cabin," Rachel continued, "I was only looking for a way to escape. Instead, I found something else, signs and symbols that told stories about the mountain's guardians, about protection and justice. I didn't understand then, but now," she gestured toward the bear, "now I see what real protection looks like." Emily's hand remained buried in the bear's thick fur as she spoke. "He knew exactly what I needed," she said simply. "When I was scared, he stayed close. When I heard strange sounds, he made them go away. He didn't leave me alone." The bear shifted slightly at her words, moving even closer to the child it had chosen to protect. Margaret nodded slowly, understanding flowing through her. "These mountains have their own wisdom," she said, looking around at the ancient trees that surrounded them. "They've watched over this land for generations, stepping in when necessary to protect those who need protection most." The clearing seemed to hold its breath as Rachel took a step forward, though the bear's warning rumble kept her at a respectful distance. "I convinced myself I was doing the right thing," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But the mountain showed me the truth. It showed me what real care and protection looked like through this creature that chose to guard Emily when I chose to abandon her." The sunlight filtered through the canopy above, creating patterns that danced across the ground like nature's own commentary on the unfolding drama. The bear remained vigilant, its presence a constant reminder of the mountain's power to intervene when necessary. Its eyes, intelligent and aware, watched the group with understanding that went beyond animal instinct. The descent from the mountain began as a solemn procession. Emily held Margaret's hand firmly, while Richard walked close behind them. Rachel followed at a slight distance, the weight of the morning's revelations visible in every step she took. The bear accompanied them to the edge of its territory, its protective presence unwavering until they reached a certain point on the trail. As they made their way down, the paths that had so confused Rachel earlier now seemed clear and direct, as if the mountain had decided its purpose had been fulfilled. The mysterious cabin was nowhere to be seen, though everyone knew it remained somewhere in the forest, waiting for the next person who needed its message. Emily occasionally turned her head back toward the sound of the bear's footsteps, a small smile playing on her lips. The creature had become more than just a protector during those crucial hours. It had been a friend when she needed one most, a guardian sent by the mountain itself to ensure her safety. The morning's events had changed them all. Richard's practical worldview had been forever altered by what he had witnessed. Rachel's carefully constructed justifications had crumbled in the face of nature's intervention. And Margaret's connection to these ancient peaks had been affirmed in ways even she hadn't expected. As they neared the base of the mountain, they came upon a circle of stones, carefully arranged in a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be natural. The group paused, feeling the weight of the moment. The bear had stopped a short distance behind them, its massive form still visible through the trees, standing as a silent reminder of the mountain's power to protect. Margaret looked back at the peaks that had played such a crucial role in the morning's events. The sunlight caught the morning dew on the stones, creating tiny rainbows that danced across their surface. She turned to face the group, her eyes holding wisdom passed down through generations. "The mountain always protects those who are worthy," she said softly, her words carrying the weight of ancient truth. The wind seemed to pick up at that moment, rustling through the trees in what sounded almost like agreement. Emily's face lit up at the sound, recognizing the mountain's voice one final time. The bear let out one last gentle rumble, not a sound of threat, but of farewell. Emily turned toward the sound, her hand raised in a small wave. "Thank you," she whispered, her words carrying on the breeze. The massive creature stood watching for a moment longer before turning and disappearing into the forest, its role as guardian complete. Rachel looked at the circle of stones, then back at the mountain peaks rising behind them. The morning's lessons were etched deeply in her mind. How nature had stepped in when she had stepped away, how the mountain had refused to let her escape the truth of her actions, and how wisdom had come from the most unexpected sources. As they made their final steps toward home, each carried with them a piece of the mountain's magic, a reminder that in this ancient landscape, justice and protection came in many forms, and that the mountains themselves kept watch over those who walked their paths. The sun had risen high in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees as the group made their way back to the cabin at the base. The morning's events would become part of the mountain's long history, another story of protection and revelation in these ancient peaks that had watched over countless generations. Dear listeners, we hope this tale from the Adirondack Mountains has touched your hearts and reminded you of nature's profound wisdom and protective power. For more captivating stories that explore the mysteries of our natural world and the depths of human nature, subscribe to our channel and click the like button below. A special playlist of similar tales awaits you in the link to your left. Share your own experiences with nature's guidance in the comments below. We believe every story has the power to inspire and transform. Join us tomorrow for another unforgettable journey into the heart of human experience. Until then, may the mountains watch over your path,